Following on from yesterday's video about employers having no disciplinary process in the event of a gross misconduct allegation. Now, in the event that an employer doesn't follow the minimum ACAS procedure and an employee has 2 years continuous employment, then they would be successful in a claim for unfair dismissal if no process is followed. Now, so that means the employer would have a judgment against them for unfair dismissal. Now, when it comes to compensation, this is where it really matters in relation to those types of claims. Because if the employee has been guilty of the gross misconduct and they would have been dismissed anyway, so if the employer had followed a fair and reasonable process, so followed the ACAS code and dismissed them, if they had done that and would have been dismissed fairly anyway, then the employee's compensation is limited in those circumstances. So they would still be able to recover what we call a basic award, which is the equivalent calculation as redundancy pay, so based on age, length of service and weeks pay, which is capped by the government each year. And so they would be entitled to basic pay and then a small award for compensation on the basis that the employer failed to follow any process. But it would be very limited in terms of compensation, recognising and acknowledging that the employer would have been able to fairly dismiss them anyway had they followed a fair process. So this is why in some situations of gross misconduct, employers will skip the process and merely dismiss somebody, especially if it's something very serious and there's clear evidence that they've done it, because they know that commercially the value of that claim to the employee for unfair dismissal is low. That being said, if you're an employer, I would always recommend following a minimum ACAS process with all employees, regardless of the allegation or length of service. It just minimises your risk and ensures that you're following a fair process. And for employees, if you're in a situation where you have been found guilty of gross misconduct or you have committed gross misconduct and your employer fails to follow any process in dismissing you, then you need to think carefully about the cost benefit of pursuing a claim for unfair dismissal if the employment tribunal would find that you would have been dismissed fairly anyway had they followed a process.